is under investigation for allegedly seeking U.S. assistance to prevent a military coup following the death of Osama bin Laden. Panelists examine what this incident means for Pakistan's internal politics and relations with Afghanistan, India, and the U.S. This is just over an hour and a half.
Good morning. I'm Hillel Fratkin, a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute and director of its Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World. It is my duty to welcome you to this event, whose subject is Pakistan, the crisis state. And I may add, I'm welcoming all of you here in this room as well as our C-SPAN audience. This duty is an important one, but also, for me, a personally sad one. It is an important duty because Pakistan is an important country, and also a country in the midst of a great crisis, a crisis which affects important American interests, as well as Pakistan's own. It is a personally sad one because a most grave expression of this crisis are the difficulties, the undeserved difficulties, of Hussein Haqqani, until recently Pakistan's ambassador to the United States. Hussein is an old friend of mine, a former colleague, and a former colleague of other people here at Hudson. Among other things, together Hussein and I founded the journal called Current Trends in Islamist Ideology. From the first, Hussein's interest in this venture was to address and hopefully redress the dangerous and destructive forces abroad in the Muslim world generally, but also in his native Pakistan. In accord with his faith in Islam and as a Pakistani patriot, he strived with all his great energy, intelligence, and courage to help to find a way forward for the health of his country and its relations with other countries, including the United States. Eventually, it became his lot to pursue that ambition as the Pakistani ambassador. His fulfillment of his duties came at a most difficult time in U.S. and Pakistani relations, perhaps the most difficult ever. Still, Hussein took up this task and defended his country and its interests with exemplary vigor and skill. No one in Washington is in any doubt about this or his dedication to the cause of Pakistan, but all are amazed at the success he achieved. For his pains, he now finds himself under virtual house arrest at risk of his very life, a serious risk in a country which has in the past year already seen several political murders. Why is he in this situation? Well, he who has endeavored to protect and advance his country stands accused of betraying it. By whom is he accused? By a man who many people know him and have known him for many years, who describe him as a serial liar and a con man, active in these low arts for nearly 20 years, and whose evidence is non-existent. In other times, these charges would receive no credit. Unhappily, in today's Pakistan, they do. This is, I think, not because these charges are actually believed, but because they are deemed, in the present circumstances, useful in the low and dangerous political struggles that now convulse Pakistan. A struggle, I might add, which reached a new and heightened state over the past few days. It is thus that his situation represents, as I said earlier, the crisis of Pakistan, and I should add the shame of Pakistan. It is the double shame of men who speak of honor, but instead dishonor themselves with attacks on their most loyal, genuinely loyal, and able sons. Perhaps they will come to reflect upon this, reflect upon what true honor requires, perhaps discover what a great American president, Abraham Lincoln, once described as the better angels of their nature. I hope so and pray so. pray that Hussein will soon be able to return to his great and patriotic vocation, the health of his country. For the present, it is my last duty to turn over our broader discussion to our panelists. Let me only add that they are all lifelong students, distinguished students, and lifelong friends of Pakistan, and all associated with the most distinguished institutions in Washington. Their presence here today and the discussion they will provide testifies to their concern for Pakistan and its relations with the United States, as well as their concern for Hussein Haqqani. It's now my privilege and pleasure to turn the proceedings over to Teresita Schaefer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hillel. I am going to remain seated, as my fellow panelists have decided to do, but I wanted to set the stage for this discussion. The invitation you received referred to Pakistan, the crisis state. We do meet at a time of crisis in Pakistan. It is, first of all, I would say, a clash of institutions. The civilian elected government dueling with both the army and the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, whose independence it proudly reaffirmed during the days after President Musharraf tried to fire the Chief Justice. But the definition of that independence at the moment, at the very least, is up for grabs. In the past, the Supreme Court has been overtly controlled by the elected governments and has also shown deference to the military. It's not clear that both of those dimensions of independence are still in full vigor. Secondly, another dimension of the current crisis is a clash within the civilian political sphere. This is by no means new to Pakistan. In fact, I would say it's the normal order of business. But you have a government headed by the PPP, an opposition in which the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz is the prime mover. And you now have a third actor, Imran Khan, whom one of his admirers described to me about a year ago as having fans but not supporters. It appears that he now has some supporters. Whether that is going to change his ability to gather votes at the polls, we will only know when the polls happen, but he has certainly become an important part of the political landscape. I know that a number of people in the room just came from a Skype conversation with him in which he said some things that were quite familiar and some that were less familiar. The big themes that we wanted to pursue this morning are two that are tremendously important for Pakistan's future and indeed for any country's future. One is justice and the other is rule of law. Each of my fellow panelists will have a perspective on this. I would just like to end my introduction on a more personal note. My husband and I lived in Pakistan in the mid-1970s. Our older son was a year old when we got there. Our younger son was born there. The news of the assassination of Punjab Governor Salman Taseer clutched at our hearts, not just for the reason that many people share, that this was a voice of toleration that had been killed by his bodyguard, but also because he was killed a few feet from where we used to go to the bookstore and the barber shop and the playground where our kids played on the seesaw on Sunday afternoons. So let me turn the floor over to the first of our speakers, Marvin Weinbaum, whom I first knew actually at that time in Pakistan. He was on a Fulbright. We were in the embassy, but who is now with the Middle East Institute. Marvin.
Thank you, Tazy. We have a crisis, certainly, in Pakistan. And it seems to be a crisis which, for the moment, is driven by some specific events that have lately taken place. This panel is going to help us understand those events, what led up to them, where they're likely to take Pakistan. But in looking at this, I'm going to ask whether it's something more than simply events which have led to this crisis, because after all, the topic of this meeting here is the crisis state. As Tazy suggested, I've been looking at Pakistan some 40 years now. And as a Pakistan observer, I really don't know that there's been any time in that period when I would have characterized Pakistan as a normal state. I know when you use the term crisis and you have a crisis all the time, the term crisis loses its meaning. So I'm asking here, before we begin this more specific discussion, I'm asking here whether there's something deeper involved here. Deeper in the body politic, deeper in the political culture of Pakistan, of which this is the latest and perhaps, in the order of things, one of the most dangerous crises. After all, there's a certain degree of cumulative effect here. You know, how do these developments and the ones that precede them, how do they relate to a system in which few people have faith in their institutions, in which there is a deep distrust of authority, where justice and the rule of law is so easily violated and regularly violated, where so much of what goes on is blamed on outside forces, where there is regular denial of responsibility. Outside forces, I might mention, that are plotting to weaken and indeed overthrow the state and take the state's assets from it. A society where what once was a fringe set of ideas about something like 9/11 today is a virtual consensus in the country about it being an American plot, perhaps an American Zionist plot. This is generally believed throughout the country, and it's only one of many such beliefs which, at least as an outside observer, one finds so difficult to understand. The obsession here with India and lately with the United States. And I could go on, and you could go on, and certainly everyone on this panel can give us far better examples here. Well, could I sum this up? Let me give you a list. Long-term lack of trust, feelings of lurking danger, interpretation of the actions of others as hostile, misconstrue friendly actions looking for hidden motives, conspiratorial explanation of events, easily slighted, in denial, refusing to accept responsibility, difficult in its relationships. Now, you may think I abstracted this from some of my remarks. Actually, that list comes from Googling the term paranoia. These are the textbook, classic, clinical syndromes of the paranoid personality. I was astounded. There were none there that I would have said, well, that's clearly doesn't belong. So if Pakistan is, as we've said, a crisis state, and others, by the way, have had other labels. It's been called a national security state. It's been called an insecurity state. Lately, it's being called a hard country. Do we also have to say it's a paranoid state, but go further than that and say it's a paranoid society? Because that's what we're really talking about here. It's not just a matter of the elites interacting. We're talking about something which is far more pervasive and deeper into the, as I say, the political culture and the body politic. Now, is this fair? Is it fair to throw around terms like this? After all, individuals are not nations. What is said and done in the interests of the state obviously can sound very rational. And I don't mean to demean Pakistan. I do mean to understand it. Now, also, there are individuals who clearly are far away from this in Pakistan today. Individuals who have shown enormous courage in being a voice of sanity. But they are embattled. And that's why we're here today. It's not peculiar to Pakistan. Other countries have experienced periods of paranoia, including this country. But there seems to be something more resilient about what we're talking about in Pakistan. And it doesn't mean that everything that's being said by any means is irrational. But if you look at the assumptions on which this dialogue often occurs, you find that those are indeed non-rational. And I could go on here and suggest a Manichaean part to it also, and it brings in Imran Khan because of the belief that while the world is hostile, there are some figures out there who can deliver us the good against the evil. I don't have time to develop that notion, but let me now conclude by saying, so what's the value in using these terms? Can it better help us understand here what to do? So let's go back to the textbook and see what the textbook suggests. It says, first of all, that it's not really curable, but it is manageable. It says that there are no single therapies, that formulas of political policies which are somehow going to change things. I'm putting this now in state terms, but there are no therapies which, as such, can work. No silver bullets. It says, don't get angry. It says, don't act in a threatening manner, because it only exacerbates the symptoms. Don't expect that the individual is going to understand its problems. So, finally then, where is the application? You know, it's easy to deal with this if you want to break the relationship. You move on. You have no interaction. But if that relationship needs to be preserved, if it's of interest to preserve it, then we have to go back again to what is suggested about how you ultimately manage it. And you manage it, the textbooks tell us, the clinical textbooks, with regular interaction. Yes, engagement. That's the management therapy that's recommended. And in interstate terms, that means diplomacy, with keeping in mind the limitations. In intrastate terms, it means democracy. Both of these are processes. Both of these don't assume easy, short-term solutions. So there is here a formula, after all. It's not one which is very satisfying. It's not one which answers our problems immediately. But again, if it's worth preserving, it's what we've got to work with. I will now turn the panel back to the crisis at hand, but I thought that this was perhaps useful to understand that the problem may be far bigger than just the immediate events that we are confronting. Thank you.
Thank you, Marvin. Our next speaker is Dr. Christine Fair, Assistant Professor at Georgetown. Dr. Fair has written on everything from politics to food, and I believe she's going to be a little closer to the political end of that spectrum this morning.
All right, I'll try to leave all pork jokes aside, but I've got bacon on the brain. All right, so let's talk very briefly about what MemoGate is. I think we've all heard about it, but let's try to put it in some sort of structural context, because what it is really important in understanding where Hussein Haqqani is and what it means for Pakistan's democracy. So Mansour Ijaz, we all know about him. He's a dubious character. He's done all sorts of things that are bizarre. He has the credibility of a snake. But nonetheless, he ostensibly delivered a memo to then Chief of the Joint Staffs, Admiral Mullen, who said he actually got the memo but thought it was so insane he disregarded it and didn't act upon it. And this was allegedly delivered in the aftermath of the May 2 death of bin Laden, which we know was a very tenuous time for Pakistan. I actually had the privilege of being in Pakistan 2 days after bin Laden got whacked, and it's kind of like going to the Michael Jackson Neverland Ranch. It was really, really bizarre. So, whatever was what was actually going on vis-a-vis the Fauji's or the Army's thinking, will be left for historians to decide. But the memo alleged that a coup was in the brewing, an assessment which I personally did not share. And the memo requested that the United States government intervene to help put the Army back in its place. And in exchange for doing so, the author of the memo promised that the Pakistan government would be civilian controlled, would pursue more sane policies with respect to India, nuclear proliferation, as well as groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba. In other words, for the most part, what was being offered in the memo was that Pakistan would behave as its constitution, in fact, tells it to, right? So what very few people have had the sort of sense of saying is that even if this memo was authored by this government, it's hardly treason. It's simply articulating and requesting the United States to reinforce the constitutional structure that Pakistan actually has. Oh, by the way, it's not the first, last, or only time that some sort of Pakistani official has asked the U.S. government to get involved in Pakistan's internal affairs, the first of which I believe was Pakistan's first premier, when he actually said if the Americans would help the Pakistan army, he wouldn't even raise an army. Right, but somehow that has not been. This is the Liaquat Ali Khan. So this memo, provided that it was real and authored by a Pakistani official, it's not the first, last, and still not the only time. Did the army howl when Musharraf came here with his hand out asking for a check and a bunch of other stuff. So let's put this in context. This was not unique in any way, shape, or form. But the Pakistan Supreme Court, how did the Supreme Court get involved in this? What is the nature of the proceeding that faces Hussein Haqqani and others that are involved? For those of you who have been watching Pakistan for the last several years, you know the Supreme Court has been, it has been characterized as independent. I think that is a grotesque mischaracterization. It is very interventionist. It is activist, right? It has powers that our Supreme Court does not have. It has sui moto powers. So it can actually take up an issue if it thinks it is of public importance. And we can question whether or not the issues that it takes up are in fact of public importance or the personal importance of the Supreme Court justice in question, right? So that's a different debate that I don't want to go into here. Where this particular case came to be is another interpretation of Pakistan's constitution, that anyone can petition the highest court, which ordinarily is the highest court of appeals, the court of last resort, if the issue pertains to a fundamental deprivation of human rights. And so under this clause, this provision of the Supreme Court, Nawaz Sharif, who claims that he's a Democrat, says that this memo, in fact, violates this fundamental right to liberties, and that it therefore is the subject of the Supreme Court. So the first ruling that the Supreme Court engaged in was whether or not Nawaz Sharif's petition was maintainable, okay? Having concluded that it was maintainable, it's ordered a judicial collection of judges to rule within 4 weeks on the dispensation of the memo. Where did it come from and who wrote it? Now, what makes this particularly curious but also invidious is whether or not, so Hossein Haqqani's lawyers simply argued that it wasn't maintainable. That was obviously lost. But what makes this particularly invidious is that Hossein himself is not being tried. That's not what the Supreme Court was evaluating, because there have been no charges filed in any other lower court, which, as in all judicial proceedings, there have to be charges filed. So what this process has allowed the Supreme Court, working on, I believe, if not explicit collusion with the military, then in a parallel simpatico with the military, has allowed various pieces of so-called evidence which have not been forensically validated. There have been no custodial chains of, there's been no custodial chains for these evidence to be entered into the Supreme Court, put into various affidavits, and laundered on its website. So, for example, let's take a very concrete issue, the BlackBerry exchanges. There has been no forensic evaluation of the authenticity of those BlackBerry exchanges, right? Mr. Ijaz has a series of exchanges. He writes in his affidavit, this explains this, and this is how this BlackBerry exchange connects Mr. Hossein Haqqani to the memo. Now, in any actual court of law, obviously this would be risible. It wouldn't even be considered, right? There's no forensic evidence validating the BlackBerry exchanges, much less tying the BlackBerry exchanges to the memo, right? But because there have been no charges filed, there is no requirement to do so. This also means that Mr. Haqqani was not allowed to file a counter narrative, explaining, well, actually, Ijaz says this, but this is how I explain this particular BlackBerry message. Right? He never denied the BlackBerry messages, or at least the most recent communication does not suggest that. However, all of this information is being churned in Pakistan's public domain, right? So in other words, Hossein Haqqani is essentially being labeled as a traitor. There is no actual evidence that has been forensically validated presented before the court. And for anything, so in other words, this is really trial by media circus. Now, I want to take on the other canard of Pakistan, this so-called free this free, vibrant media. It is the freest and most vibrant media that you can buy, that the ISI can influence. I know countless journalists who are simply speaking on the ISI payroll. And anyone who knows Pakistani journalists will back this up. So it's not that it is this entirely free press. And also Salim Shahzad might have his own views about the extent to which this press is entirely free. So it's really important that we understand what's actually going on here. I've written a piece in Foreign Policy, I think it's out, and there's something I wrote last year where I was talking about the role of the Supreme Court in manipulating Pakistan's democracy, from, I guess, going back over a year ago. In my view, while where many of us are concerned because we've worked with, in a variety of capacities, are friends with former Ambassador Hossein Haqqani, we need to understand what this is. This is, in my view, I can't speak for my other panelists, a slow-moving coup. This is a way in which the military has at its disposal to try to bring down this government. How is it a slow-moving coup? Well, here's my interpretation of events, and I think it bears some similarity to what we saw with Benazir's father, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, right? When they took the head of his security and coerced him into becoming what's called an approver in Pakistani's parlance. I guess in our parlance it would be a state's basically a witness for the state. So one interpretation, and indeed when I met with Hussein Haqqani last week, this is his interpretation, that they're trying to use this proceeding to scare the bejesus out of him, or put the fear of Allah in him, whatever your preferred metaphor is, to get him to give up the goods on Zardari to bring this government down, right? So this is a well-worn playbook that this military has at its disposal. I want to also emphasize that, before I wrap it up, that this is the second judicial mechanism that this court's using to go after this government. You may have remembered when part of the U.S. efforts to launder Musharraf's legitimacy through the ballot box with Benazir Bhutto, there was the National Reconciliation Order. That order, among other things, dropped various corruption charges against PPP members, oddly enough, not PMLN. In fact, not oddly enough, that was the purpose of it. And it paved the way for her to come back and to contest elections. And obviously the plan of laundering Musharraf's legitimacy through her electoral legitimacy failed when she was killed, and that's how we ended up with Zardari. But the Supreme Court had been very dubious about that NRO to begin with, and when Zardari became president, the Supreme Court raised the possibility that it would vacate the NRO. And you may have remembered one of the very early rows after the election between the PMLN and the PPP, who in the wake of the election actually formed a coalition, was the restoration of the Supreme Court justice that Musharraf actually had jettisoned, and that was Chowdhury. So this row between Chowdhury and Zardari now goes back several years, and so we should not see this as some sort of new phenomenon. But this particular track with Hussein Haqqani and Memogate really relates as well to the vacation of the NRO. So in conclusion, I really, while we all care about Hussein Haqqani, I want to emphasize that this is not simply about the particular personal safety or lack thereof of Mr. Haqqani, but it's also about Pakistan's democratic institutions. The only way that Pakistan's democratic institutions can fructify is if there are multiple constitutionally mandated changes of power that happened at the ballot box, right? Using judicial means in the media to try to prorogue this government is not in anyone's benefit. And I want to just very briefly end my remarks with Imran Khan. Some people have asked, well, why the NRO? Why is it coming back now when they had actually vacated it 2 years ago? Well, there's a really big reason. If you're the army, you really didn't want Nawaz Sharif around, right? We all know the Nawaz Sharif relationship with the army. And we know the army is not very fond of Zardari. So it's not as if you had a palatable option. Well, it's not a coincidence over the last 6 months, Imran Khan's fortunes have really changed in significant ways. He went from being a political joke to actually being a political force. He's been able to course not the right word. I'm sorry, I'm jet lagged. I just came back from Pakistan. He's been able to persuade Kajol, probably with the help of the boys at Apara, a variety of turncoat politicians to join his party and bring with them the vote banks. They're also having to vacate their seat in the National Assembly with the explicit goal of trying to bring about early elections. So in answering the question, why the NRO being brought back now, well, it's because the army now has a chance. So if we care about Pakistan's democracy as well as Hussein Haqqani, the United States government really needs to be much more vocal than it has been. We need to work with our partners, send a very clear message that we recognize that this is a coup, albeit by a judicial coup. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Our next speaker is Stephen Cohen of Brookings Institution, and before that of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Steve and I are now colleagues at Brookings, and he has in particular been a watcher of the Pakistan Army, but I believe that what he has to say is going to go beyond that. Steve?
Thank you, Casey. Is this good enough? Let me say that Brookings is pleased to co-sponsor this event, and I'm pleased to participate in it. But I'm happy that it's taking place at Hudson. Years ago, when I was a graduate student, I attended some lectures by Herman Kahn, who founded Hudson later in his career. And Herman Kahn was a futurologist. He was one of the first big-time futurologists in the United States. But his interest was nuclear weapons. And he wrote a book which described, among other things, World Wars III to VII. He wrote in there was a chapter on titled "Will the Survivors Envy the Dead?" The answer was no. In the case of a large thermonuclear war, he was quite a remarkable person. But we're in the same position that Herman Kahn was. Our imagination knows no limits, but it's still very hard to say what will actually happen. Humans are blessed or cursed with the ability to look ahead and imagine the future. We're also cursed by an inability to actually know what the future will be. So this is an exercise in futurology, and it spins out of the book I just edited called The Future of Pakistan. So I want to look at the Pakistan, the crisis state, the state marinated in crisis, how it's going to look, what the alternative futures for Pakistan, drawing from that book and writings of others. But I think a cautionary note is that Ambassador Jack Matlock, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, once said, I'm paraphrasing here, to the effect that he wasn't sure what would happen to the Soviet Union, but when it did happen, he would be able to explain why it was inevitable. So we could come here a couple of months from now and say it was inevitable that this happened or that happened. I think a large dose of humility is required when talking about things like Pakistan or nuclear war, for that matter. So let's talk about Pakistan today and tomorrow. I think the present crisis began with the 1999 Musharraf coup, but really from 1965 onward, Pakistan has been in crisis. And after Musharraf's failure or collapse as a leader, I think the hope for Pakistan gave way to deep pessimism. And a lot of the literature, a lot of the writings about Pakistan is characterized by deep pessimism. But I detect in this literature 4 broad scenarios about the future of Pakistan. The first one is not the most popular, but the dominant one seems to be the muddling through scenario. Now, muddling through is not simply a slang term; it's actually a term of art. And Charles Lindblom wrote a marvelous article about the science of muddling through. And muddling through happens when you're not quite sure what to do. You sort of do a lot of things, and you hope that things come through. So it's a policy of hope. And the argument is that Pakistan is in trouble, but the forces of unity and coherence will ensure that it will not dramatically change soon. Despite chaos, it is best to assume stability. And I think this is the view of Jonathan Paris, wrote a fine study out of London about the future of Pakistan. Anatole Lieven's book, Pakistan, the Hard State. And our book on the future of Pakistan, but our book only, at least my chapter, looks ahead 5 years. So in a sense, muddling through, but with a shorter time frame. Now, there are 2 other scenarios which are muddling through, variations on muddling through. One is muddling through plus and muddling through minus. Muddling through plus is best epitomized by the edited book by Malia Lodi, former ambassador to the United States and a renowned journalist. And I call this the if syndrome. And Malia argues, and it's a collection of essays in there, many of whom make other arguments, that if Pakistan can only reform its economy, if only civil military relations can be normalized, if only the terrorists can be tamed, if only this can happen, if only that can happen. If is the operative word here. But after that, then there's a bright prospect for Pakistan. And nobody doubts that Pakistan has, or perhaps had, a bright future, given the resources, the talent of its people, its location. Pakistan had a lot of resources, a lot of assets, but clearly it's underperformed in many ways. So the muddling through positive scenario is if all of these things happen. When we had the meeting to discuss our book, for some discussions I ruled out the term if. In fact, a conversation about Pakistan should not include the word if. Because if you start using the word if, you're going to, if this happens, of course, then it's a glorious future. Well, I think we should ban the word if in these conversations. Now, the muddling through minus scenario is quite different. And it's characterized by John Schmidt's recent book on the unraveling of Pakistan, or some of Bruce Rydell's writings, a book of his and an article. And one article is called Armageddon in Pakistan, or referring to he also referred to the Emirate of Pakistan. And a new book that's just coming out of Scott Page Bruce by Ahmed Rashid, Pakistan on the Brink. I think that's the second book I've seen with that title. And now they argue that Pakistan may not muddle through. And it may not muddle through for one particular reason, and all 3 authors are concerned with this reason, that is the Islamist factor is going to overcome good intentions and good abilities and good people and drive Pakistan, if not to destruction, at least to worse and worse scenarios. So all these authors pick on the Islamist factor as a critical variable in a negative future for Pakistan. They don't predict catastrophe, but they're less optimistic, certainly, than Malia Lodi and others about what happens if muddling through doesn't work. There's another option, the one I favor, and I don't have a good title for it, but I call it the serial transformation of Pakistan. Nothing massive is likely to occur. And frankly, if there's a coup d'etat, I would not be surprised. Now, I don't think it would change things at all. I think Pakistan will continue on the way it is going. Pakistan is what Aristotle called a mixed constitution. It's part democracy and part military autocracy. So these kinds of states are very hard to predict. So I think that, but I think what is likely to happen, what is happening in Pakistan, is that parts of Pakistan are changing in different ways. I won't go into the details. It's spelled out in my own chapter in the book. But it's a very different kind of Pakistan than the one Ambassador Schaefer and Professor Weinbaum were in 1970s, the one I visited first in 1977. So Pakistan is changing, but changing in bits and pieces in ways which are not always pleasant, although in some cases it's changing for the good. Now to conclude, Pakistan is a crisis state, or crises, or sequentially crises. And why is this the case? Because it's a paradoxical state. A paradox is a statement or proposition that seems self-contradictory or absurd, but may express a truth. So I think there are many paradoxes, but at least three I think are important for this discussion. First, there's the domestic political paradox. And as I've said, Aristotle talked about mixed constitutions. Pakistan is part democracy, part military autocracy. You can't tell at any given moment what kind of state Pakistan is. In a sense, that's an asset of Pakistan, being a chameleon state, and it's very hard for other countries to deal with Pakistan. Yeah. It behaves like neither all the time, and it's hard to tell which Pakistan we're dealing with at any given moment. Second, there's a nuclear paradox. I think this would warm the heart of Herman Kahn were to hear this. Pakistan, like North Korea, is too nuclear to fail. Yet nuclear weapons do nothing to advance the economy, deal with the many domestic problems, and the possession makes Pakistan important to others and to Pakistan's own population, but that's all they do. Now, it doesn't bring Pakistan many advantages. I do agree with A.Q. Khan that having nuclear weapons has kept the Indians out of Pakistan, but Indians might not have been interested in invading in any case. So some of Herman Kahn's worst scenarios could come true if Pakistan follows an erratic nuclear path. He talked about war between the Americans and the Soviets, a massive global thermonuclear exchange. He also wrote about catalytic war, where a smaller nuclear state triggered off a war between major nuclear states. Here I think the Pakistan relationship with India and with China is something that deserves further study. And of course, there's the new issue that Khan did not write much about, the issue of nuclear terrorism. Thirdly, there's a third paradox, and that Pakistan's relations with other major powers is deeply problematic. It is America's most dangerous ally. India-Pakistan relations are better than U.S.-Pakistan relations. It professes to be a democracy, but its three most important allies are the People's Republic of China, North Korea, and Saudi Arabia. So Pakistan's identity, I think Marvin hinted at this, is problematic. But I'm confident that there are enough good people in Pakistan, I think I put Hussein Haqqani at the top of that list, who really could manage the state were they given the opportunity to do so. So crises are going to continue. The fact that the military may take over in form, if not in name, does not trouble me. What troubles me the most is the deeper underlying transformation of Pakistan that's going on right in front of our eyes. I have some comments on policy, but I'll deliver those after Lisa Lickett.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. And before we get to our final speaker, I am reminded that Professor Fair has to leave at 11:30. So I thought that if there were one or two questions that specifically touch on the legal and on judicial issues that she raised, I would take them now, and then we will turn to our final panelist. Could I remind you, if you're going to ask a question, to identify yourself and your affiliation, even if I know you, and to wait for the mic so that our watchers on C-SPAN can also hear your question. There's a question down here in front. Wait for the mic, Dr. Saab.
Thank you. I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhry with Pakistan American League. Christine has a very good grip and handle on the affairs of South Asia. The Haqqani case, I think she has read it more than anybody else. And the case is in the judiciary, and Nawaz Sharif, when he was the Chief Minister of Punjab, and he was opposing People Party, and Benazir Bhutto was the Prime Minister. I received the Chief Minister Nawaz Sharif, and Haqqani together. They were the best friends and advisor to the Chief Minister of Punjab at that time. And then he was subsequently advisor to Nawaz Sharif, who went to the Supreme Court now when he was the Prime Minister. So I think the case is in the judiciary. And if somebody wants to help Haqqani, I think one needs to hire a good attorney who knows the international law as well as the Constitution of Pakistan. And I think that would be helpful for him. If that can be done, certainly there will be fairness. But one thing I assure you, there is not one single individual on whom the future of democracy of Pakistan lies. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to answer, or do you want to wait?
If there's another one, I can take them
No.
together.
If there's another question for Dr. Fair, I'll take it right there in the third row.
Yeah, Professor Christine Fair, I would like to please ask
Could you identify yourself, please,
Yeah.
sir?
I am Ahmar Masti Khan. I'm a freelance writer. I'm from Balochistan. I'd like to please ask you the tragedy that Mr. Hossain Haqqani faces. It is more or less the tragedy of Pakistan. May I please ask you, is it that instead of the generals who were hiding bin Laden being ousted, the ambassador was trying to control Islamic radicalism, he faces all these problems and his life is threatened? Doesn't it clearly shows Pakistan is a failed state?
All right, I'll take these together, and I'm not going to accept the premise of that question, because those are premises that I don't personally accept. So let's again go back to very clearly what is the case with Hossain Haqqani. No FIR, which is First Information Report, that is to say charges have been filed against him, right? Without any charges having been filed, he voluntarily went back, his passport was seized, he lives under virtual house arrest. So, the irony is he is experiencing fundamental deprivation of liberty. Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury, for pointing out that the relationship between the current Supreme Court Justice and Nawaz Sharif goes way back, because Nawaz Sharif was his prime champion. And in fact, that was the reason why the coalition between the PMLN and the PPP broke apart in the first place, was over the disposition of the Supreme Court Justice and the disagreement between the Sharifs and Zardari. I also want to point something else that I find this is Pakistan's judicial system. The Supreme Court is very different in that it has been pushing the perimeter of what it is allowed to do. And it gets away with it because it's the only arbiter of